So the topic today is, of course, understanding Terraform documentation. Jason, would you say that it is intuitive? It is easy to understand always?
No, not at all, actually. It can be really difficult trying to translate what you want to do into the documentation.
Yeah, and I find that's true of a lot of documentation, frankly, but perhaps more so for development stuff, API docs, SDKs,
Hmm.
and that may be just because, and this is a fair point to bring up, I do not have a development background, but over the years I've developed some skills in various languages. You don't have to be a real developer, if that's the term, to be working in Terraform, to be working in any of these GitOps designs. We are probably mostly infrastructure people coming to this development table and using some of those tools. I mean, that is what GitOps is all about. I'm going to get right into the documentation, and we're going to start going through the pieces that I feel are really important for everyone to understand better. And hopefully it'll make this a little bit more palatable. And as you then use the documentation going forward, it should make it a lot easier for you to find the information you're looking for, and more importantly, to actually apply it to your problems. All right, so starting out, I just want to highlight one of the, or some of the most prominent documentation locations. So I've got here terraform.io, and this is actually the CLI documentation specifically. So this is where most people start their journey. They're working with Terraform, the binary, the executable. And so even before you start writing code, perhaps it's important to start understanding how to use the CLI. Jason, you've used Terraform CLI, obviously. Have you also used Enterprise or Terraform Cloud?
I've used Terraform Cloud
Okay.
documentation. I haven't used Enterprise yet.
Okay.
I feel like it's very similar to it.
Yeah, I've used Enterprise a little bit, and a lot of my work is done at the command line with the Terraform CLI. And when you start using Enterprise, at least, I haven't used Cloud, but when you're using Enterprise, at least, you're doing a lot less at the command line with the CLI, and that I don't want to say it bugs me, but I always feel like I want to get back to the CLI so I can kind of get that immediate response, that cause effect kind of thing from the actions that I'm taking.
Right, because Terraform Cloud, a lot of it is repo based. So you like check
Right.
things into your repo, and then it pulls it down. So you're like doing CI/CD stuff. Um, it's still running stuff in the command line. You can see the command line if
Right.
you chose to, but
And it's the same way with Enterprise. You get
a lot of
an
these
output
tools,
console.
a lot of these tools also are used. Like if you need to modify your state file, you'd be in this documentation trying to figure out what to do.
The CLI documentation will actually go through some of the features of all three of these, the Terraform CLI native, I'll say, but also Enterprise and Cloud. So all of these pieces are in here. I think some of the important things to understand, though, are some of the basic uses. And the documentation will provide you a usage guide just printed out as you might see within your environment, within your console. And I think that this is relatively easy to follow in terms of the documentation. There is a lot more that's complicated, but this one's relatively easy to follow. So, but I think also that it's probably something that a lot of people aren't reviewing, and these things change from version to version. So I believe that's important to understand. For instance, I came across recently, I believe when you try to do targeted applies, if nothing else, the console now warns against it. It highly, I don't know if it outright blocks you, but it definitely highly recommends that you run a targeted apply step via a plan and then apply the plan. Whereas in the past, I was able to do a targeted apply directly via apply. So that may have changed. So it's always worth checking out these main and alternate commands that are available for the CLI itself. And the documentation gives you the rundown just like a help screen would, but it also gives you details around why you might execute some of these. I guess the specifics of that and how they actually work. One of the things that they give you actually are the internals, which talk about debugging, which talk about the protocols in use. There's even a section in here around TF Cloud login and how that's called. So there's a lot of in-depth detail going on in the CLI that a lot of us just miss. And you actually called out one in a previous episode when we talked briefly about providers. You have to have the provider CLI in many cases because Terraform will interact with the token that you've acquired via that CLI for authentication. And so the CLI features actually speak to that and point out how they actually interact with those elements on your local machine. So when it comes to troubleshooting issues, a lot of times understanding how the CLI works will help you with those troubleshooting types of things.
One thing that I've run into is, like, if you're talking about debugging, even in Terraform Cloud, you can use the TF log to do debugging, like, locally. And then you can also put that environment variable in Terraform Cloud, and it will give you the same output as the TF, like a local TF log. So, you're like,
and you're referring to the environment variable TF log, and setting your log levels. So that's really important because I think the CLI help output is not going to make that obvious. I'll make this a little bigger so that we can see that on the screen better. But the documentation, of course, points to that and gives you the details of this is an environment variable, and here are the valid values for that environment variable.
Yeah, there are lots of tools within Terraform CLI that you could use, and modifying save files, creating logs. You could use it in Terraform Cloud. You could use it locally. It's super helpful.
The next thing that we can look at is the language reference. So here we're looking at how one uses the CLI, and that is perhaps the first experience that a lot of us get with Terraform. But the other thing that you need to understand is how the language works for writing the code that you're going to be referencing. So in that case, also terraform.io/language, we're going to see a language reference documentation, which goes into the details of the HCL, which is the HashiCorp configuration language. Am I right about that, Jason?
I think so. It's their own.
Okay. Yeah, it is their own language. Now, they also support JSON, but I don't know a lot of people that are writing pure JSON to write the configuration code. I have used JSON for input variables, but that's pretty much it. Within the HCL, there are a couple of constructs that are really important to understand, I feel, in order to understand all the rest of the documentation that you're going to be going through. So one of them is that just this, right? There is the CLI, there's the HCL, and then we'll touch on it later, there are the providers. And all of these are separate contexts within the documentation. Within the HCL, then there are additional building blocks. One of those would be the element type. And the element types that you're typically working with within Terraform are the resource blocks as well as the data source blocks. And you could think of it like this: a resource block is CRUD, right? It is the writer, if you will. It creates resources within your provider. And then the data source block is more like the read part of, so it's got very limited CRUD. It is a read element, and it reads elements which have been created by a resource block somewhere else. The only ways you can really read things are by having a connection to a provider that has that element, or by creating it in flight and then reading that data structure directly within the same code.
Couldn't you, like, if a resource is already created, you could just use the data resource and pull it down, right?
You can, as long as you're using the provider that gets that information. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. The resource block includes the read elements that the data block provides. The data source does not necessarily provide all the same things that the resource block provides. I'm trying to think of a good example of that, but a lot of times what you see is that the resource block has a lot of outputs that all occur sort of in flight as that resource is created. When you read it later, some of those elements may have disappeared because you are simply reading a resource from the provider that exists, and you're not within the context now of having created that. That kind of gets into I think that gets into the next important building block, which is just that. It is a block, or it is an argument slash parameter. Yeah. Arguments or parameters. They're kind of the same thing, or attributes. That's actually the word I was thinking of. So the subtle difference, as Terraform explains it, or as HashiCorp explains it, is that arguments are going to be options for a creation. So they could think of functions, think of your resource kind of as a class or a function, and arguments are things that shape that function and that resource. Whereas attributes technically are just aspects of that object, right? They are read-only variables, if you will, for an object. So in some contexts, they use them interchangeably, and I think people in our shoes typically use them interchangeably without thought to what the distinction is. But the documentation may at times reference attributes when they mean read-only values, and they may reference arguments for either. It could be read-only, or it could be a shaping property. So the documentation does speak to that a little bit within these different settings. So if you look at the Terraform language, you'll see all of these sections, and unfortunately these sections may not mean anything to you in the beginning because you don't yet have enough familiarity with Terraform. And I think this is probably one of the biggest stumbling blocks that you run into. You don't know to search for blocks because that's not a term that you're familiar with yet. But as you work with it and as you've come to understand it better, I'll point out a really important element here, and that is the filter tab right here, or the filter input right here at the top of the documentation. So if I do a search here for anything that I'm thinking of, and it could be block, for instance, suddenly I get some context to that. So now I see actually examples or information on resource blocks themselves. And so it's beginning to show me the structure of what those look like. It's talking about what a block is, or perhaps what a block is not. And it gives me some defining characteristics. A block is a body of content between curly braces, that kind of thing. There are also some notes that are really important to understand. Resource names must start with a letter or underscore and may contain only letters, digits, underscores, and dashes. I don't know if this is true with you, Jason, but I tend to use underscores almost entirely within my Terraform, within HCL. Now, when it comes to assigning attributes or arguments, then I'll use anything. But as it relates to Terraform elements, and it's probably because the documentation uses them a lot, I use underscores to represent all of those elements.
I'm generally more free-flowing. Hopefully it's consistent. But I think yes. I tried to use, I think I use more dashes. But
do you?
I never really even thought about that too much.
Yeah, I think what got me at some point was my linter. So if your linter understands dashes and underscores the same, then you probably wouldn't ever notice. But if for whatever reason your linter highlights dashed words differently than it does underscore words, then that may be why you use one over the other. The other thing would maybe to sort of disambiguate the subtraction symbol from which you might be using in a function from some sort of element type. So that may be a reason why you use one over the other. But clearly, the documentation spells out that it doesn't care if it's an underscore or a dash. Those are all inclusive. And in fact, there's an element in here somewhere that refers to the text that the input text that you can use. It must be Unicode conformant, but they've added dash. So I think that there's some spec that indicates dash maybe is not part of the standard compliance, but Terraform has added the dash as compliant within their language. So resource blocks are one of the building blocks that you need to understand, or any block for that matter. And the reason that I call that out is because I think commonly they are crossed with a different type. And so if we look at variables, then we will see different types of variables that are allowed. And the one in this example that they're showing right here, I'll zoom in a little bit if that helps. They're actually showing a list object type, and you'll see that we have curly braces wrapped around body content here. But unlike a block, just above that, the variable block is defined as variable name and then open curly brace and then content. A map type is shown as a value with an equal sign and then words, right? But curly brace. And you'll see below that it's not always necessary. So I have a value equals, and then here's our curly brace block. So it's really important to understand reading that difference and knowing that this is a value map, whereas the other, highlighted here, is a block. And that'll come up and be really important as we look at the registry in just a minute. One other element that we need to look at within the documentation, and this is very specific to HCL, like many other languages, Terraform has its own set of expressions and functions that are used. And in this case, we can look at the table of contents that they're providing on the left, and there's an area set aside for expressions and functions. So I find that certainly in the beginning, I didn't know what functions were available, so I don't even know what to search for. You could get lucky, and if I do a search for time, then I might find something that works for me. And you'll see right here, I've got date and time functions. And so these are the types of things that I'm looking for. But, maybe I was actually looking for a now function, and it just doesn't show up. So in order for me to find what functions are available, I'm going to go into the functions category. And those are further broken out nicely. I'll say this has changed over the years, but this is a much nicer way to provide this. So now as I look through these subtypes, I can see date and time functions, and I can see all of the functions that are available to me for date and time specifically. And I don't have now, but I do have something called timestamp, which might be the thing. And you'll see that timestamp returns a UTC timestamp string in 3339 format. So that's probably exactly what I'm looking for. And there might even be ways to change that format that you could search for as well. Now, functions, unlike blocks, look a lot more, I would say, recognizable to us. A function is going to be the function name, open paren, close paren, which means that there are things that I may be able to put inside of those parentheses to alter the way that that function's called, or in fact, there may be parameters that are required. So that is the case in format date. I look at format date, it actually has two requirements for it. And so I mentioned maybe we can change the format of the date time syntax. Obviously you can. I can put a spec on that, a specification, and then source the timestamp. So in this case, that second argument could actually be the function that I just used, which was timestamp. So I could format date, open paren, specify the specification that I want, comma, and then timestamp function right there to grab the now date time in a different format. So that's functions. Now, how does that differ from expressions? It is subtle, I'll say. Expressions sometimes are, it's almost like, as I think about command line kind of syntax, there are things that we use in Bash or Command or PowerShell that we don't think a lot about. Now, PowerShell is unique in this, but in Bash and Batch, if I say if, there's no executable that called if, right? That is strictly, and it's not a function. It is an expression in the language that we're using. So similarly here we have, and we have conditional expressions similar to if. And so you'll see here, we've talked in a previous video about ternary logic, and here they're showing an example of an if statement is conducted by ternary logic, because we say if condition, then true value and false value. And you can check the link or check the, we'll include a link to the previous video on ternary logic here as well. So that's expressions. And so if you're looking for if, you might get lucky and find it, but you'll see that there's so many results returned. If is just not enough of a word, not a restrictive enough word for us to filter on. You might also get lucky and search for conditional and get sent right to it, but lacking that, you may want to glance through expressions and see if there's a topic under here that matches what you're looking for. So in the previous example, I mentioned the now function of time date. I might have looked in expressions to see if there was some sort of format operator for me to format my time date in a particular way. Not seeing it here, then I would continue on into functions and find that date time functions or string functions and see if there's anything in here that might do what I'm looking for against the value that I've got. So you can see similarly, there's a format which works against a string as opposed to a time date object itself. It's important to point out too that everything that we're looking at when we look at expressions and functions and variables, when we're looking through all of this documentation, we're looking at current version. So if you happen to be somebody who is using an older version, and that is quite common actually, that you get kind of stuck in one of the older versions, then you need to be able to get to this documentation for your older version. And unfortunately, there's not like a qualifier on the documentation. I would love it if they provided just like a radio or a drop down for me to select the version that I'm currently running.
Isn't there the historical? It. Sorry. Isn't there is the bottom left?
Yep. Yeah, I'm just pointing out that it's not in line.
Oh, yeah. That makes sense.
I can go somewhere else. Yeah. I've seen examples where the documentation will actually show the same function, but depending on the version you've chosen, the function may disappear or the way that you call it will disappear. There is, of course, a historical configuration language option for the documentation, and within that same page, the language page, at the bottom they've got historical docs, 0.11 and older. And I'm actually, it's kind of curious. So like 12 and greater seems to all live within the same documentation. That's a little hard to believe, but obviously they're calling it out. They may actually create notes within the docs that indicate. So just like they've added a note here, this is for 11 and earlier. For 12, go back to the root of the configuration language. I think there are some places in the notes that actually say this documentation is valid for 13 or 14, for 1.0, see this, or here's the change that's introduced with that. So as I say, it would just be better if they collapsed all of this in one place and I could switch to my version and it just shows me relevant documentation. But not knowing that, I think it's important to understand how to get around between historical and present documentation. So if I'm searching for information about my version of Terraform, a lot of times I'm just going to start on the Googs or whatever. And so I'm going to search for, we'll just do time add. So what you'll see is, of course, all the regular results, but you'll be given a link to Terraform language as well. And when you go there, just remember that it's always going to be current language that you're dropping to. It's kind of hard to get a search result back that takes you to the historical. So if you are working with historical, you're going to need to switch to that context first and find the same thing that you're working in. And because it's historical, they ordered the documentation different back then, and so you'll notice that it doesn't have the same structure as what we're getting used to, I guess. I definitely appreciate the newer docs now.
Yeah, I've never looked at the old ones.
I remember using it once upon a time, and I remember how confusing it was now. It was way worse back then.
Right. I think a lot of, like, the reason why it's like 11 and above is what they changed the formatting of like the variables. You didn't need to put braces around everything.
That's right. That's right.
That kind of stuff.
Syntax differences.
Like 13, 14, 15 had more challenges with like state file changes than like actual syntax. Like you're trying to do, like, I remember they like changed between like 14 and 15, they changed how some of the state file stuff works, so you had to update it.
If you are looking for historical information, Google may not have sent you directly to it. It's going to prefer the modern documentation. One of the things that I'm noticing is that there's not a lot of reference, perhaps any reference to functions. What I wonder, and I know that the function documentation used to be in here, and it was a little buried. It wasn't quite as obvious as it is now. I certainly appreciate the modern documentation over the old stuff, but depending on what you're looking for, you may just need to make sure that you're filtering. So if you've arrived at this section from a Google search on something, and override files is up right now. So if we were looking for override files, then we can see here that there is, if I didn't have that expanded, I might miss it, right? But there is a historical reference to overrides as well as a modern reference to overrides. So depending on the version you're in, or depending on what you're here for, you just need to make sure that you're looking at the right one, because there aren't always easy ways for you to know which version you're looking at. Acute eyes will notice in the query string in the address bar that you'll see a -11 in the URL string. So that will remind you what version you're actually looking at if you happen to be looking at the wrong one. They also, I know, prominently place this note at the top of all the historical documentation, letting you know that you need to look at the more current stuff if, in fact, you're running a more current version. Okay, so a lot of the things that we've talked to are building blocks, and you have to continually reference this area of the documentation. This is how the HCL works, and it's critical in knowing how to write code for Terraform. But I think where a lot of us actually get stuck is we're sort of in the deep on the provider documentation, and it makes you forget about the HCL, and you're working off examples that the providers are giving, or you're searching the internet and you're just copy pasting other examples. And so you're not really taking advantage of what the HCL can do for you, and you're certainly perhaps missing the context, or missing the nuance of how some of the code actually works. So when we're looking at the providers, we're in a totally separate area of Terraform's documentation, and this is a change from the way it used to work. I actually preferred the old way. I liked it before when everything was kind of under the same umbrella, and now it's a completely different site with a completely different look and feel. So I just feel like you kind of have to have both of those sites up at the same time to reference the documentation from both. And I just wish that there was a better way to go back and forth. The registry, though, it gives us now examples in use around providers and modules. Modules goes into basically custom code, so I'm not going to dip into that much. What I will say, though, is that modules do provide oftentimes really clear documentation. So the modules, because they are perhaps community contributed or user developed altogether, they read like documents in some case. So in some cases, you'll read these and they are sort of talking about some of the best practices. They're giving you all the ways in which you can interact with it. And they're giving you reasons why choices were made in the module that were made. So I think that module code oftentimes shows us good examples of how the documentation could be done. And then there are also details. And this is actually a HashiCorp developed module, so it perhaps a little unfair. If we look at one of the user provided ones, yeah, so here's one not provided by HashiCorp, and this one, I mean, they're even using a font and logo, or is that just an ad? No, this is their logo for the people that actually produce this module. So just like some niceties that they're throwing in here, and still providing kind of a long form document, which is sometimes nicer to read than stereo instructions. But I digress. We want to look at providers because, as I said, providers is where we spend a lot of our time buried. And because I am partial to this, I'll dip into Azure. So even though it is the Azure provider, it's actually called Azure RM, which is the resource manager, the ARM, if you will, Azure Resource Manager. And this is a provider that is that holds closely to the Azure APIs, but depending on the function that you call, it may call a different API. So if we were to dip into the code for this provider, and this is true of all the providers, each of the resource types or data types can call different APIs as needed. And I'll just point out that every provider is going to have a source code link at the top. When you first go to the provider, you're going to be given this link to the source code. And going there, you are looking at GitHub. It is something that you can contribute toward. I highly encourage you to do this. If you don't like the documentation, then this is how you can make changes, assuming it's approved. But you can also learn about what's coming, and you can learn about how things are implemented, what versions of APIs are used, all of these types of things. Log issues, very important. So this is kind of important in the line of documentation, but a more advanced use case. If I just want to learn how to use this thing, there's a couple of things that are going on here. The first that you need to understand is when I go to the provider, I'm going to see a use provider link at the top that's in purple here. And so if I pull that down, I get a copy paste code block that I can use to immediately start putting this provider to use in my code. So if I initialize Terraform, and we learned this from the Terraform CLI documentation, that init is the first step you take in order to pull in provider details and binaries, to initialize a state file, a backend, if you will, to sort of prefetch modules, things like that. So this block of code will immediately get you started, but it won't take you any further than that. And depending on your linter, it may or may not give you more information to go on. So you then need to go into documentation to see how this thing is used. Now, provider documentation can be comprehensive. And what I find is that depending on the provider, you may have tons of things over here on the left. So similar to the HCL documentation, it's broken up into a table of contents. But in this case, we just have so many. And well, if I don't know Azure and I'm trying to use the Terraform provider for Azure, it may be a little bit of a challenge because I don't have enough context within Azure for me to actually get started. But if I know just enough, perhaps I know that I just need to create a storage account, whatever that is, then again, I can filter at the top. And if I just type storage account, you'll see that there's a good number of things that are listed here. And in this case, you'll recognize that there's a naming standard in place here, and it always looks like it's prefixed with Azure RM _ some name, and I guess that's it. Azure RM underscore and then some name. And so if I look around here, I see a category called storage, and then there are resources for Azure RM storage account. So I can better filter learning this and get it down to something that is a little bit more specific to what I'm looking for. So now I'm looking for Azure RM storage account. And that's interesting. I feel like we've got a broken filter because instead of being more specific, it actually got less specific. Do you see that? I've got 47 matching results for Azure RM storage account.
I think they're searching inside the content too.
They may be instead of just the name. I swear I used to be able to type this in and get like just that item.
I was you were talking about not knowing like the documentation, like if you don't know the provider but then trying to use the documentation. So for example, I am trying to learn more AWS Terraform. I went to create an Elastic Beanstalk app, which is similar to an app service. And apparently you have to create the role as before. You have to create the role for Elastic Beanstalk for it to run beforehand, but the documentation doesn't really say that.
The provider documentation doesn't say that? Okay.
So sometimes, like you were saying, the documentation, like it's like almost there. So you have to kind of know both you actually have to know the cloud stuff. So you have to know the cloud that you're kind of using and the Terraform.
Yeah, that is an important distinguisher. I know the case in Azure is that a lot of people are using the portal. And when you use the portal, there are implicit actions taking place when you do anything. So you probably forget about it, but when you create something like a storage account I have that I'm searching for, then it will automatically go in and create a resource group for you. Now, it's all within the form, so if you think about it, these are all separate objects, but it'll create all these things sort of in line to you creating a storage account. But the truth is that those are all separate actions and, more to the point, separate resource types that you have to build. You have to build a resource group resource, and you have to build a storage account resource. And if there's maybe an identity that you want, you may have to assign those rights, which is another resource. In fact, a different provider in some cases. So yeah, it is, if nothing else, I found personally that working with the provider in Terraform, working with Terraform in general, gave me more knowledge about the service that I was consuming, Azure in this case. And so it sort of reinforced what you know about the platform, and sort of put you in a place where you had to more clearly understand what the actual requirements are for any resource that's out there.
Yeah, I agree.
Virtual machines were a great example. I don't know if you found this, but in the portal, you're like, I need a VM, and you create a VM, and you get a VM, right? But VMs are actually built of a bunch of different resources, because you've got a disk, and you've got the NIC object itself. The public IP is a separate object, and you've got the virtual machine finally.
If you wanted to use a scale set, you had to have that created at the same time. Otherwise, you're going to blow away your VM and rebuild it. Just stuff like the GUI is nice, but when I traditionally have learned Terraform first and then did it in the GUI if I had to. So there's a lot of times there is a like it doesn't always add up. You have a conversation with somebody and they're like, oh, this is true, and you go and you look, you're like, no, I don't remember that. I can make that change. And then you find out, oh, well, yeah, you can make the change in Terraform, but you still have to do something different.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that's why this like documentation is helpful, but you kind of have to do both. Maybe you can tag this at the end. This documentation is critical but you still every once in a while need to go back into the GUI and then, maybe tinker around and make sure you're following all the processes.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying sometimes you use the portal just to develop an artifact because you want to see what it looks like, what the options are that are available for it, and just kind of play with it. That's like your sandbox to figure out what it is that you're trying to get and see if maybe it just works with your code. But once you understand what you're trying to get, you need to come back to the documentation and figure out how to get exactly that artifact with the documentation. And in doing so, kind of to your point, sometimes I find little bits that are in the document or in the provider itself, right? They're exposed in the documentation. They give me more advanced control over the thing than even I realized I had in the portal, or perhaps it just wasn't in the portal, but it does exist at the API level when interacting with the cloud in this case. Okay, so we searched for storage account. I found a resource type under storage for storage account, and I also found a data source. And we talked earlier about understanding the difference between those. And so if I were just coming in fresh to the registry documentation, which is oftentimes the way this works, because when I'm using Terraform, I have a practical use. I need to create things in Azure. So I start looking for Terraform and Azure related information, and this is where it takes me, but it's not the whole story. So at this point, if you're new to Terraform and relatively new to Azure, you don't know if you need a resource or a data source. You might even conceive that a storage account could be a data source because you're going to host, it's a table, or you're going to host files out there that are just going to be read, but you'd be wrong. So if you want to create it, then obviously looking back at our fundamentals for HCL, we need to use a resource type to create that object. And if we want to read an existing storage account, then we would use a data source type. Let's just click on the resource type to see the details. So one of the first things that you're given here is always, I would say, an example. And sometimes there are multiple examples, which is helpful, because there are typically a lot of different arguments that go along with any given resource. And it can be helpful to see multiple examples because they may have different prerequisites, or they may have different terminology, different syntax in order to construct it that way. So I do like it when they provide multiple examples. But ultimately, you're going to get past the example and start looking at the argument reference. So this is where
real quick.
Yeah.
I wanted to. So can you go up just a little bit? If you look at this example here, this actually gives you from 0 potential things you would need to for a storage account. So
that's right.
Like for example, if you want to, you'll need a resource group. You may not necessarily need a VNet, but you need a resource group. So sometimes the documentation actually gives you the full path to get to the resource you want to create. So like in this case, it shows you this is the minimum that you need to create a resource group.
Right. Another thing before I move into the arguments themselves is that in the HCL documentation, we talked about versions and knowing which version you're actually looking at. The provider, the registry documentation did it right. You see at the top here, we've got a cookie crumb menu showing us where we are. And the last element is a place where I can choose the version of the provider that I'm actually working with. So if you're like me, many of you are not actually using the latest version of the provider at this point. You may be using something a bit older. And so you can jump to that. And it didn't keep me on the same page, unfortunately, but you can jump to that and then you can start browsing that documentation as of that version, which is very important. You get back to storage account.
I don't think I've ever seen that.
You missed that one before?
I don't think I've ever. So I just assumed that if it doesn't work, I don't have the newest version.
Yeah,
try to update it. But that's funny.
If you've ever been like, I got stuck on an old version for quite a while, and so I found myself in just the habit of viewing all versions and going back to, my version, which is way down the line. And I think a lot of enterprises run into this, where you've pinned a version, which is a good technique to practice, but you don't have a process, this is GitOps, right? But you don't have a process yet to push yourself into currency with these versions, with these life cycles. So it's very helpful to be able to get back to this version of the documentation to see how things worked.
That makes sense. I just never.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, let me fix what I need to do inside that code, or yeah.
That's probably a better practice, arguably, to go ahead and make yourself current rather than sticking with the old stuff.
Well, especially if it gets too old, then you're like really having issues. But most work, you have to go on to the next thing, so it's understandable.
Yeah, and each of the versions, not each of them, but the versions, one of the things that changes between versions is the Azure API version as well. So newer versions of the API may actually open up newer services. So imagine, if you will, a version of the Azure API that didn't have storage accounts. There wasn't one, but maybe there was one that didn't have the SKU of the VM. So you want a VM that has a good video card on it so that you can run workload that requires hardware decoding. Well, that SKU didn't exist on an older version of the API, so you may actually have to move up in order to take use of some of that new functionality. Looking at the argument reference, though, this is kind of where things get nuanced but important. So the argument reference lets us know what things that we can actually pass into this resource block. So if I'm working with a storage account resource block, these are all the things that I can put into that. And it doesn't sort these like I might appreciate, but some of them say required next to them. And it would sure be nice if this documentation had a way, at least for me to quickly run through here and see it, or a way for me to filter to show me all required fields. But you may have to browse through a little bit to identify all your required fields for creating this particular resource type. And one could perhaps get clever and start searching for required and let the browser highlight them for you. But it would be nice if the website just did that for you so that you could quickly identify it. You can see, so some of these say required, but they're only required if I'm using that particular block. So if I decide to create the custom domain block, then name becomes required. And it doesn't tell you this automatically. You just have to understand that it's a context thing. So if I'm in the scope of the custom domain block, then this is required, but otherwise it is not required. Arguments also will sometimes go between just name value pairs, like this one, name. Get rid of my search here. So this one is just going to be a name value pair, and you can see the examples of the way that works. Name equals. In other cases, it's going to be a block that it's referring to. And we talked about blocks a little bit earlier, but let's see if we jump down to network rules. So we see here, network rules refers to a network rules block documented below. And when I, let's see.
That click never works.
It really doesn't. I was just kind of hoping it would. I was hoping it would because we were showing, maybe it's because I'm not showing the latest version. Let's try.
No, I don't think it
still doesn't. Just always hopeful.
Yeah, when you click on it, it doesn't necessarily take you to where you think it's going to take you.
It doesn't. One day these things will work. So I will show you something that does work related to that. Yeah, it doesn't. So it does put the word custom domain right at the top of the screen for you. So that's helpful. No, it's not. Yeah, so it's referring to a custom domain block as documented below. Now, this is a long document. So here's an example where it might actually be helpful for you to filter. So if I find that block that I'm looking for, then I can see. So when it says a custom domain block, then I need to know from the HCL documentation the way that that's structured. So that's going to be the word custom underscore domain followed by an open curly brace. That's how I define a block. And then these name value pairs are going to exist underneath that. And I can see the examples within the documentation that they provided. So you'll see here the, let's see, the network rules block, and then I've got name value pairs inside of that. Now that's really important because you may misread that and think that IP rules is just another value that I can pass into the storage account, but it has to live within the block under which it's documented. And so once you understand that context, then the documentation becomes a lot easier to follow, because then I can see if it's referring to a block, then I know that I have to define that separately as a child. And blocks can be nested. So you may find that once you get into that block, it says this supports a block of X. And so you have to create another block inside of that. And it can be as many as it needs to be. Now I'll show you the clickable link doesn't work, but oddly enough, if I copy that and I send it over to somebody, oh, it didn't work. I swear I have seen this work where it'll take you right to the value. It did not, though, yet again. So we're still having trouble with that. This is something that HashiCorp perhaps should fix. And perhaps this is a good time to bring up the fact that you can always report an issue about documentation over here. So there's a report an issue which takes you directly over to the GitHub link. And so you're able to just add to their 1,500 issues log the thing that you found. And you can also contribute. So feel free to check out the code, see if you can fix the piece that you're identifying as a problem, and check it back in. Now, I will say that this feels a little bit more systemic because I know that all the pages work the same way. So perhaps it's just different in the way that we are using it versus the way they're expecting people to use it. But this is probably worth a discussion rather than just an issue logged. And let me check real quick, see if they have discussions. They do not. GitHub now has a discuss tab that some people are using. This one is not using it, but they may open it up. But discuss tab is really good if you are producing an issue. Maybe you don't know if it's an issue. Then there can be a place where you go and discuss it first to figure out what good looks like, what does bad look like, and then you can start or contribute to the discussion instead.
So one detail while you're at that screen.
Yeah.
While you're on the screen, if you click on the notifications at the top right and you have a GitHub account, you'll receive an email every time the provider is updated. And they update once a week, AWS and Azure. So I receive emails every week on what has changed. And so I can, implement the new changes into my scripts.
Which is that usually by way of a new version of the provider, or is it just a new way to interact with it? Okay.
It's a new version.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's good feedback. And I think it's also important that people just know that this is not an untouchable area. Like, you can be a part of this aspect of the providers, that they're all looking for help, that they're all, and the way that things can get better is by the community contributing, the community logging issues, opening discussions, what have you.
Yep. And it's Microsoft who's creating these.
APIs so
in the Terraform.
I was going to point that out. Obviously, Microsoft maintains the Azure APIs. So you'll see badges on providers, and you see up here that we've got this little ribbon, which marks this as official. So an official provider is one that HashiCorp effectively owns, as opposed to being community provided. But they do so, I think in all cases, they do so with a partnership of the upstream provider. So in this case, it would be Microsoft. So Microsoft and HashiCorp are sort of co-supporting this provider, and HashiCorp owns responsibility over it because they're the name on it. but then Microsoft obviously owns responsibility to HashiCorp for their part, which is the API. But yeah, official is certainly a good badge to see. And if you are browsing the providers, there are only so many officials listed. And so you can see here, it's a pretty good list, actually, 35 official providers. So these are all things that HashiCorp owns support for. They're responsible for these things, but they do so in a partnership with the other company. And then there's verified, and I don't remember. Verified, you can see based on the buy. Verified is that the upstream provider is actually responsible for that particular provider solely. It is not HashiCorp at all, but it is the organization that provides that service, not a community provided service. So if we look at the last one, then it's community provided, and this can be anybody that develops these and makes them available. The other important thing is generally at the bottom of this. So once you get past arguments, you're going to be at attributes. And so here's, I mentioned this early on, here's where that distinction happens between arguments and attributes. Arguments are the things that shape your resource. Attributes are read-only values that are artifacts of a resource. And both data sources and resources both have attributes associated with them. So when I create the storage account resource, these are all the, we'll call them output. These are all the attributes that you get from that. So I can reference any of these values from that resource in the same context in which I created it. So if I'm in a piece of code and I create a storage account, I can actually display the primary access key directly within that same code by outputting that value. And this is important to understand because all of the things that you defined as arguments may not actually be in here. And sometimes there are notes explaining why, and other times there aren't. And so it's worth, if you're trying to get at a value, it's worth looking through the attribute list before you make any assumption that you're going to be able to get to that value. It's also important to see what that value name is, because it may not match your expectations. The last thing that I can say about the attribute list is that it's not always so simple to get at the attributes. These are all name value pairs, so they're super easy, but when they're inside of blocks, then you have to start digging a little bit deeper into the cookie crumb name syntax. And there's some discussion in the HCL under the output section, how you reference values. So that becomes very important to understand because it's logical. It's applied the same way across all different data types, and it's important to understand. If there's items, so if you have more than one of an instance, then there's a certain way that you refer to those as well. And then the last thing is your import. So Jason, you mentioned doing things in the portal and then kind of exercising things there and then learning to code it later. So if you do it that way, you might find yourself importing those resources into your code. So once you've written the code to represent your resource, you then have to do this Terraform import statement. And this is a CLI argument. So the very first thing we talked about was the Terraform CLI. And so we can understand how import works or why it works, when we use it, when we don't use it. But all of the resources will give you an example for how you would actually call the Terraform import command, which then pulls it into state and allows you to interact with it as part of your infrastructure as code.
Yeah, be careful when you do that.
You have a hard lesson learned from that?
No, well, I've just, my general test question for somebody would be, you already have a resource group, you've been using it forever, you have lots of resources. Then you create a resource in your Terraform script, and then you import that resource group into your script, but then you haven't included all the other resources also. And then you decided to rename that resource group. Since it's now in your state file, it is being manipulated with your code, and you can destroy your resource group if you're not careful, even though you created it in the portal.
That's probably important to read the output of your CLI. So again, understanding this,
Read
how the
that plan.
CLI works. Yeah,
It says
read that.
destroy. You'll triple check it.
And if it's 148 things in the plan and you can't scroll that far, then you need to output that plan to text and review it carefully. Because you're right, that if we ignore that, then this is where problems occur. So one of the things that we see is sort of this this formatting of the code. And everywhere you look, you'll see a very similar format being applied. So if we want to be consistent, by reading the documentation, it's teaching us how we should probably be structuring our code. And it'll be easier for the linters to understand the code that you've written as well. I'm going to switch over to another screen and we'll take a look at an example. I'm just going to drop some code in here and we're going to make some changes to it and just make sure that we're getting to some sort of consistent formatting. So I'm going to use an extension within Visual Studio Code to help me with that. And this is kind of cool because this particular extension will take examples out of the documentation and just drop them into my code. So from a starting point, it gives me everything in that example code right here in Visual Studio Code where I can then edit and manipulate that. So I'm going to do storage account, and you'll see here when I do storage account, it's then giving me data and resource objects. So I'll just grab the first resource object. And so it just takes exactly that example that we saw here, and the other one was there too, but it takes that exact example and just drops it right into the code. So that's kind of my starting point. And if I'm writing this by hand, then I might find myself saying, I'm going to create a tag and just putting my name in here as the owner. And I'm then going to say, create another tag that is the start time. And this one's going to be, oops, that's not right. There we go, timestamp. And so my linter is highlighting that green to show me that that is a recognized function. You can see things are getting a little bit messy. I didn't follow the formatting. I just dropped things in as I like. And I can even come down here and write another object. So maybe I want to create a key vault resource. Then I might do it this way. So now I have a different resource that's structured altogether differently. And you start to see where the linter is having some problems with how I structured that, right? This might be valid, but the linter doesn't like it, so it's not going to look good for the file. So what I can do is make use of one of the CLI commands. And the CLI teaches us, and this is one of the commands I think is not used very often, but the CLI teaches us that there's a parameter we can pass called FMT, which stands for format. And if I do that, then in this case, it faults hard because it does not, the linter is right about this. It does not like this broken return where I put the curly braces on the next line. It doesn't support that. So it expects this to be structured just like this. And so I'm going to write it this way. All right, one line because it's just a one value. But when I run format, it allows this. That's fine because it's a one-liner. But you see how it fixed the tags for me automatically. It structured that, and it can structure things that are pretty complicated. I've actually had no problems with it. But what it does is it produces content that looks exactly like the examples look. And one of the really cool things about it is that, like these name value pairs, it automatically spaces out. It puts this gap in so that your equals are all lined up and your values are all lined up. So this Terraform FMT does several things for us. It makes our code more legible. It brings us into standards compliance as far as the documentation formatting goes. I mean, it just organizes things in maybe not the way that you were thinking, but certainly in an aesthetically pleasing way. So I would recommend everybody use that. And there are other nuggets within Terraform CLI, within HCL, within the provider, the registry documentation, that will provide you really amazing value like this. And it takes zero effort for me to apply this to my code. In fact, when I run Terraform format, it runs it for the entire directory that I'm in. So it'll fix all my code in one pass. And I oftentimes will do this to modules where I'm not necessarily paying attention to how it looks. I'm just kind of running through and fixing things, run and gun, I like to say. But I can go back and run Terraform format against that. It'll fix all of the documentation and beautify it for me. And I have something consistent that when I share with my peers, they know exactly what to look for.
Yeah, so I should probably run that in all my code.
This is something that you do not practice.
I've used it before, but I was just thinking about it as you were talking, and I probably should go do that.
I think a lot of people miss that. They may have run it a couple times. It may have been quite a while since they remembered that, but I think that there's some really good pieces in there. There's also like Terraform validate, and I know most people will just go directly to apply because it does all the steps for you, but you have to wait for it to get through all of its work in order to finish. And if the only thing I want to do is validate my syntax, is I can run Terraform validate, and it does that one quick check. And I know as I'm writing code, I'm introducing errors. Like I'm just going too quick. I've got variables that weren't defined, and I'm just running through it. So let me run Terraform validate just to see which things I've forgotten to close the loop on, and then I'll go back and clean those up before even attempting a plan or an apply step.
That reminds me, one tidbit about the documentation, especially as you were talking about storage accounts. A lot of the values are case sensitive. So oftentimes the documentation will be very specific, like GRS is in caps or something like that.
Oh yeah, the values you pass to the API, right?
Yes. So when you're running your Terraform and then you apply it, it may bomb out if you haven't copied it exactly.
Yeah, and I hope that validate, so this is a good use case of validate. I hope that validate will check that. It may not always catch it, but I think the intention of these providers is to make things like validate work properly. Now, there are some things that are only detected when you apply them, because perhaps the values aren't even known until you apply them. But perhaps for some of the values that you're typing in, it will know automatically if that's a valid value. Okay, so that's a wrap on Terraform documentation. There are lots of other sources by the community that provide different levels of documentation. I've just gone over the ones that Terraform provides you, and I think it's a real important step to understanding, comprehending, and making yourself better with Terraform. I don't want to say before you ask, read, but it will take you a much further. So if you do understand this documentation better, I think you'll have better luck at putting it to use. And so then, of course, the questions that you ask will be more to the point of fixing your particular problem rather than just fixing some sort of syntactical error.